Okay, you've probably never heard the name Nísia Floresta. And that's exactly the point. Because back in the 19th century, this writer and educator quietly kicked off a revolution in Brazil. She's this forgotten pioneer, and trust me, her story is absolutely fascinating.
So, was she Brazil's very first feminist? That's a title historians still debate. But what we know for sure is that long before the word was even common, she was fighting for women's rights in a society that was literally built to keep them silent.
I want you to picture Brazil in the 1800s. It's a conservative, new empire built on slavery and patriarchy. A woman's world was tiny and strictly defined. But Nísia Floresta, she refused to accept that. And with nothing more than her pen, she started to take apart the very ideas that kept women powerless. So who was this person? Before we even dive into her radical ideas, you really have to understand her life, because she wasn't just writing about rebellion, she was living it every single day.
Just look at this timeline. At 13 years old, she separates from her husband. That was an almost unthinkable act of defiance back then. Then she starts a school for girls that gets attacked for teaching inappropriate subjects, like Latin. Her writing gets her censored by the empire, and she's forced into exile. And after all that, she dies forgotten and in poverty. This isn't just a biography. It's like a rap sheet of a life lived completely against the grain.
That rebellious life, it fueled her most powerful weapon, her writing. And it's all packed into one small book with a surprisingly humble title, but a message that was anything but.
She called it an opúsculo, which, just means a little pamphlet, a short work. Now, why would she do that? Well, it was a brilliant strategic move. By downplaying her work, calling it imperfect, she was basically disarming her critics before they could even attack. It was this sort of required performance of humility for any woman who dared to write something serious. And right at the heart of that so-called pamphlet is this incredibly powerful plea. She says that while the whole world is crying out for the emancipation of women, our weak voice cries, "Educate women." I just love that. She calls her own voice weak, playing that humble part. But the demand itself, it's revolutionary. For her, the first fight wasn't for the vote, it was for the mind. And here's how she framed her case, which was just so smart. She put it in terms that the men in power would actually understand: national progress. Her argument was simple but revolutionary. You can judge any nation, its level of civilization, by how it treats and educates its women. This wasn't just about fairness, you see. She was arguing that it was absolutely essential for building a modern Brazil. And to prove her point, she did something truly incredible. She didn't just argue abstractly. She brought receipts. She basically put the entire world on trial and issued this global report card for civilization. So let's check out her grades. England gets an A- for its women's moral virtues. France gets a B+ for being intellectual, even if a little flawed. The USA, a solid B, practical, no nonsense. But her own country, Brazil, oof, a clear F, a total failure. Her verdict for Brazil was just scathing. She did not hold back. She blamed its backwardness on its Portuguese colonizers, who she said never valued education. And she pointed directly at the corrupting influence of slavery, arguing it trapped the entire nation in ignorance and vice. For her time, this was an incredibly sharp and courageous thing to say.
Okay, so this brings us to the most fascinating part of Nísia's genius, the paradox at the very heart of her strategy, which is, how on earth did she get away with saying any of this?
Seriously, think about it. How do you argue for a revolution in a society that won't even let you raise your voice? Well, Nísia had an answer, and it was a masterpiece of strategy. She built a Trojan horse. This right here was her genius. On the outside, she used all the right words. She affirmed that, yes, women should be modest, devoted to the home, the language of the patriarchy. But hidden inside that conventional shell was a radical goal. She argued that if women are the ones raising the next generation of citizens, then they must be educated. They needed intellectual freedom within the home so they could change the family, and by doing that, ultimately
change the nation. A preface to her work puts it perfectly. It says she was a fruit of her time who negotiated with the current currencies to expand the narrow social fabric. In other words, she didn't try to smash the system from the outside. She cleverly used the values the system already held, those current currencies, to stretch it from within.
And this was her paradox of the powerful, frail sex. She took the accepted role of women as the frail sex and turned it into a secret weapon. Modesty and devotion weren't weaknesses anymore. In her hands, they were tools. An educated woman could guide her husband, her children, and steer the entire nation toward a better future. It was a quiet revolution, waged right from the living room.
When you look at Nísia Floresta's legacy, you realize something. Changing the world doesn't always mean being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, the most powerful change comes from understanding the world as it is and speaking a language it's actually ready to hear, all while planting the seeds of a future it can't even imagine yet.
She negotiated with the values of her century to push for a better future. And it leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time, right? To create the change we want to see, what Trojan horses do we need to build? And what language of change must we learn to speak today?